and the fleet began to expand from there. My parents weren't into cars, so there wasn't a whole lot of like, yeah, hey, let's do a project together. But they were mildly supportive of it because it kept me out of trouble. My dad gave me his old Toyota Camry, had like 240,000 miles on it. He was like, oh, this might last you for 6 months. And I was like, yeah, all right. And I was out there in the street in front of the house, like, doing all the body work and got it looking nice. And it had more than 300,000 miles on it when I sold it 5 years later, so he was surprised. And I took it everywhere. Yeah, growing up, I didn't really have a garage to work in, and when I graduated from college with a history degree, I was like, what am I gonna do now? So I got a job at a Pep Boys in Fredericksburg, What are you gonna do? I worked in the shop, did brakes, tires, alignments, stuff like that, and got my first project vehicle, which is a 1980 GMC pickup, 4x4. In Fredericksburg at that time, you could rent a house with a garage and everything for pretty cheap. And so I did. And that is the only time I've had an indoor space to work in my entire life. This was that 2 years. All the other places I've lived, it's been a concrete slab if I'm lucky, or the street if that's what was there. I've lived in Brooklyn for 5 years now. When I first moved there, I was just working on the sidewalk in front of my house. Got to know all the neighbors that way. They'd be like, hey, Papi, what's going on? And I'm like, yeah, we like bond over our crappy cars and whatever calamity had befallen it or whatever, People who are dedicated enough to it always find a way. I'm always running into these other guys that have carved out some little nook somewhere. Like I sold an engine to this guy a couple weeks back, and he had this garage space in Williamsburg of all places, but he'd been there for years, and he had like 5 Volkswagen buses stuffed in there. I was like, how did you even get this? He's like, oh man, I've been here forever. You couldn't even afford this now. Those little opportunities, they pop up from time to time, but in a city that big, that dense, and that chaotic, it's just it's just happening all the time. The real luxury thing for me was to get this shipping container with a parking spot in front of it, a whole parking lot. So I have workspace now. It's outdoor, and I have to look at the Weather Channel before I plan out my jobs, but it's been really handy. The Key Lime Pie guy has a 53 Ford panel truck, and I was like, that's a cool truck. And so I wanted to meet the Key Lime Pie guy. When I went to go see him, he was in a garage next to his shop with a bunch of other guys. They were all like drinking beers and smoking cigarettes and chopping up a big tuna they just caught off Montauk. And I was like, hey, is Steve there? And he's like, who wants to know? I was like, wow, man. He's really cool. He's just kind of like rough around the edges with kooks. He thought I was a kook or something. And we ended up becoming friends, and he introduced me to the motorcycle shop guy who was working in the back of the building. And then through both of them, I ended up meeting Brian, the landlord of this whole building. I think there's a furniture factory in there and a bunch of other stuff. There's like an office sharing space. And Brian he's a gearhead. He loves cars and motorcycles, and that's how he got to know the motorcycle guy, of course. And he's like, yeah, I'll rent you out one of these containers. And yeah, I think he's very supportive of what I do, which is basically just, I don't know, wrenching on these old cars. Every once in a while, I'll park too many of them there at one time, and I'll get a text message with a picture on it of all these cars, and it'll be understood that I should probably move them. But yeah, he's really cool, really flexible, and I have destroyed the blacktop on that parking lot. He just doesn't seem to mind, He's like, cool, man, you're building this stuff. And I tried to get him to come on the run this year, but he wasn't into it. I don't think most people aren't that stupid. It's just like $300 a month, which for New York is pretty decent. I think a lot of people pay anywhere from $150 to $400, $500 a month, depending on where you're at, but you usually can't hang out there. I have another friend, Raf Orlov, he's at Jalopnik. He found an underground garage near his place in Brooklyn, and it's perfect. You know, he's got a place to work on his car. It's out of the weather. The only problem is it's really dark, it's really damp, and it's hot/cold depending on the season. So that's what you're dealing with. I had one car, and we were looking at places where we could live in New York City because we both got jobs there, my wife and I. It was kind of like, oh, that neighborhood's cool because it's like old Guidos and stuff, and oh, that neighborhood's cool because it's near the water. And then she wanted to move into this one, and I was like, nah, it's a bunch of hipsters, whatever. And she showed it to me, and I was like, wow, there's a lot of parking here. Where do I sign? And the fleet began to expand from there almost immediately. Other people that I've talked to who are into cars in Brooklyn have to deal with parking and workspace. Those things are scarce. I mean, we're lucky because we live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of space because it's kind of an industrial area near the water. But most neighborhoods in the city, they're pretty tight. I mean, you have to move the car 2-3 times a week just to, you know, dodge street sweeping. So if you have a job that you have to have something out for a while, or a part's late, because the parts are always late, or it's the wrong part, or it takes 2 days, you know, that kind of thing, you're in trouble. A lot of guys do it, but it's not ideal. It's definitely gratifying. I mean, you get it done, you're like, oh, you're miserable when you're doing it, especially if the part comes in 2 days late and that sunny 40-degree day that you'd planned on goes by and it's 20 and windy out, and you're like, why? But when it gets done, you're like, built that shit in the parking lot in Brooklyn.